Hello, we are so glad that you could join us today for our professional learning around clarity for learning. My name is Jewett Wells, and I'm a continuous improvement coach for the Kentucky Department of Education. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Jackie Thompson and Jennifer Donnelly, and we are going to spend some time digging in to clarity for learning. This training is based around the book that you see on the screen. The book is by John Almarode and Kara Vandas, and it's a really great investment if you are looking for a good tool for professional learning for your school. So we're going to get into clarity for learning now and take you along on the journey with us. Our purpose for today's training is we are learning about clarity and its impact on teaching and learning. The reason that clarity is so important, kind of the justification for even spending time learning about teacher clarity, is that according to John Hattie's effect sizes, teacher clarity has an effect size of 0.75. So if you have much background knowledge about Hattie's work, you may remember that the hinge point in effect sizes is 0.40. In other words, any influence with an effect size of 0.40 is going to yield you about a year's growth in about a year's time. So an effect size of 0.75 is almost double your average effect size. So if teacher clarity is really implemented at high levels, and teachers are really able to understand this concept of clearly relaying learning intentions and success criteria to their students, then they can really get some bang for their buck where student achievement is concerned. Our success criteria for today, there are 3 outcomes that we hope you can achieve through the time that you spend with this professional learning. The first one is I can identify the role that standards play in establishing clarity. Standards are a vital part of teacher clarity. If we are not clear about what our standards say, then we will not be successful in relaying that clarity to students. The second success criteria is I can explain 5 ways to identify a clarity problem in a classroom. There are several really specific things that we can look for in our own instruction to ensure that we are not harming our clarity of learning within our classroom. And finally, the third success criteria is I can assess my current level of understanding of teacher clarity and its relationship to the Kentucky academic standards. So we're going to start out with building some background. You'll see on the screen, the opportunity myth is a research project that was put into motion over the last several years. This research was just released this past year. You may be familiar with it. If not, and you are more interested in looking into it more deeply after we kind of go over it here, you can access this online. It's free to access. Anyone can download it. It is quite a large document, so we're just going to kind of hit the highlights here. But if it's something that you're more interested in exploring on your own, you can find this online if you just Google the opportunity myth. So the group that implemented this research is called the New Teacher Project, or TNTP. And what the New Teacher Project set out to do is they set out to understand whether or not schools are adequately preparing students for life outside of the classroom once they graduate. And they really wanted to see if are the things that we are saying we're doing in schools really working. So you'll see it says on the screen, they partnered with 5 school systems. Those school systems were diverse, so there were rural and urban, there were district schools and charter schools, and they really wanted to get an understanding of what a student's actual experience is in a school. Jenny, if you want to go ahead and advance to the next slide.
Yeah, Jewett, I lost, I couldn't hear you for just a second, but let's go ahead and test it on this next slide.
Okay. All right, so in the opportunity myth, what happened was they looked at nearly 1,000 lessons, nearly 5,000 assignments, more than 20,000 student work samples. And this is the part that I really like, that I think is really valuable, is they took nearly 30,000 real-time student surveys. And what that real-time means is they actually stopped in the moment while students were engaged in whatever instructional activity or assessment they were doing at the time. they stopped and gave the student a survey at that moment. So it wasn't a planned event. It was something that happened as the student was actually in the act of learning. So they asked students questions about what they were doing, why they were doing it, and what they were getting from it. So when we look at the results of the opportunity myth research, here's what they found. They found that almost 90% of the students were doing what was asked of them, which is great. That means most students were on task, they were working hard, they were doing what the teacher asked. 71% of the time, the students were meeting the demands of their assignment. In other words, whatever they were being asked to do, they were doing it correctly, and they were doing whatever was required of them by that assignment or activity or assessment. More than half of the students were consistently making A's and B's. Again, you would think that would be a positive outcome. But this last bullet is the one that's really kind of shocking when you look at those other three. It says students only met benchmark on assignments 17% of the time. So when we think about the word benchmark, if we're thinking about Kentucky academic standards, those standards are our benchmarks for our grade levels. So when we are thinking about students only meeting those 17% of the time, that means they're only mastering the actual standard 17% of the time. So looking at that next slide, that's a really large discrepancy. 71% of the time, we are saying that they're being successful, but only 17% of the time that success translates to mastery of grade level standards. So what that says to us as educators is there's a disconnect there somewhere. Somewhere we are falling short of ensuring that our assignments are actually requiring students to master standards. If our students can make A's and B's and have success on our assignments, yet once they get to those benchmarks, they're not hitting those, then there's a problem there. There's an alignment problem or a congruency problem. So the implications, as I said, for us as educators are we've got to figure out what we can do to close that gap between that 71% success rate on assignments, but only 17% success rate on benchmarks. So the research throughout Opportunity Myths supports the conclusion that if students have regular access to these four critical elements in the classroom, then it will improve student achievement. So those four elements are grade appropriate assignments, strong instruction, deep engagement, and teachers with high expectations. In other words, we have to ensure that the assignments we are giving to students in the classroom are actually aligned and congruent to the rigor of the standards. We have to ensure that the instructional strategies that we are using are best practice and are well researched and proven to yield high results. Again, I'll reference John Hattie's work. There are lots of great instructional strategies with high effect sizes that we can implement in our classroom to help with that. Deep engagement. And when we think about engagement here, we're not just talking about passive engagement. We can keep students busy and we can give them lots of cool things to do. But when we are engaging students in learning, we have to ensure that it's deep cognitive engagement, and it's something that's requiring them to be problem solvers and to think at deep levels and to have conversations with their peers that are meaningful. And finally, teachers with high expectations. We all, I'm sure, have been guilty at some point in time of lowering our expectations for certain students, but we really have to ensure that we are holding all students accountable for learning at high levels and for mastering those standards. So if we can really ensure and be aware of those four elements within our classrooms, then this research strongly supports the fact that we will see those gains in student achievement and start to close that gap between the 17% and the 71%. So getting back to our purpose for this training around clarity for learning, hopefully throughout that information from the opportunity myth, you saw kind of some supporting research for why it's really important that we clearly are able to articulate learning for our students. So I'm going to give you just a second if you need to pause this slide and read through this and notice some key words within this paragraph. two of the key words we have highlighted for you and underlined, the word imperative and the word important. Those, or impossible, I'm sorry. Those two words are really significant and strong words. Imperative implies that it is absolutely critical. So when we think about sharing clarity with our students and being clear about what our standards are telling us so that we can translate those to learning expectations, it is critical that we understand those standards and we are able to dig into and take the time to really collaborate with our peers and calibrate our thinking about our standards so that we can clearly articulate those to our students. If we are not able to do that, then as it says at the bottom of this quote, it will be impossible for our students to follow and own their own learning. And that is really our goal for our students, is to master those standards and to own that learning themselves. So that impossible is a really strong word too. It has really heavy implications. We never want to make anything impossible for our students. So it really shows that we carry the burden as educators, or the responsibility. It's not a burden, it's more a responsibility, but it's almost a moral imperative that we know and understand our standards and we are able to articulate that clearly, so that our students can then know and understand their standards as well. So I'm going to give you just a second. I didn't say this at the beginning of the recording, but one of the great things about this being a video professional learning is that you have the ability to pause and rewind and reflect as you need to. So we're going to give you just a second here to reflect on just kind of this information from the opportunity myth and what are those implications for you as far as knowing and understanding your standards. So if you're taking notes, you might want to jot down some of your ideas. If you're watching this video with colleagues, that is wonderful. This would be a great time to pause the video and have a little conversation just about why is clarity so important, clarity of your standards and clarity of understanding. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jenny now to take you through the next part.
Okay, so hopefully you're back with us. We're going to go ahead and think about some of the things that Jewett talked about in context. So we're going to really think about what this might look like in our classrooms. And we're going to look at two examples, Mr. Klein's classroom and Miss Heiser's classroom. So here in just a second, I'm going to let you all pause the video again, and I'm going to let you read two classroom scenarios. And as you read those, I really just want you to think about each setting. Think about what is the same in both classrooms, what's different, and which classroom do you think elicits the greatest gains in student achievement? So let me go ahead and put that up on the screen for you. And like I said, go ahead and pause the video. I'm going to go ahead and allow for just a little bit of wait time. Okay, so after reading both of those classroom scenarios, and hopefully you were able to either, like Jewett said, have a discussion with a colleague or maybe just do a quick write on your reflections. But perhaps these were some of the things you noticed. Both classrooms definitely had structures and routines in place and they were well organized. However, there were definitely some big differences. Mr. Klein was very intentional about sharing the learning intention and success criteria with his students. And the reason he did that is because he wants his students to also have clarity around their learning. And he wants them to be able to answer the three questions you see on the screen right now. What am I learning? Why am I learning it? And then how will I know when I've learned it? How will I know when I'm successful? Ms. Heiser, instead of spending time on what the students were learning, she took time to explain to the students what they were doing, and really missed that opportunity to help students make that connection between the activity itself and the learning goal. So also, hopefully you were making some connections to those 4 commitments that Jewett talked about from the opportunity myth. Which classroom perhaps had great appropriate assignments, stronger instruction, in which setting might the students have been deeply engaged and not just compliant. And, which classroom, did teachers have high expectations for all students? And again, not to say that one classroom is good or bad, but just sort of to see the difference and think about where you're at and what your next steps are to move closer to clarity for yourself and clarity for your students. So like Jewett mentioned earlier, teacher clarity does have a high effect size. About 2 years growth of 0.75. And what I do want you to realize, though, is that teacher clarity does not just mean I understand my standards. There is definitely more to it. So in the book that we're discussing today, Clarity for Learning, they think of clarity as having 5 essential components. So when we talk about how important it is to understand your standards, that would be that first one, gaining clarity. When we take time to deconstruct our standards, think about what our learning targets are, think about what success looks like with the success criteria, that's all gaining clarity. But in order to have real clarity for both us and our students, we have to continue on this process, not just in planning to teach, but then during instruction. So we have to think and plan, how are we going to share with students? And sometimes this might mean, yes, posting it on the board, but it's much more than that, right? So how do we ensure that students know what their learning intentions are, what their success criteria is? Do we use examples or exemplars? Do we co-construct that with them? And then we also have to think about, how are we going to assess their understanding? What kinds of opportunities to respond are we going to give to students so that we can guide our own instruction and figure out where they're at in their learning progress, but also the same for students so that they can understand where they're at. And then, of course, we have to provide feedback because we're always trying to move their learning forward. So effective feedback is extremely important with clarity. And when you have a deeper understanding of your standards and what your learning goals are, then you're better able to find feedback or to provide feedback that is aligned to those learning intentions. And then the last thing is collaborating with clarity. Teaching and learning, it truly is a partnership between students and teachers. And so we're both on that journey together. Okay, so this slide sort of is going to lead us into a short video we're going to watch. So the image on here is a hinge, and it's an analogy. So we want you to think about how a little hinge can swing a large door. And in this analogy, clarity is our hinge. So clarity, you're going to see here, is really foundational to so many of the great things that we do in our classroom. It's the starting point, and it's what allows other strategies that we use to be effective. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing here for just a second so that I can turn on the video and the sound. So give me just 1 second. I think I stopped presenting, but I don't know. Hang on.
You did stop presenting, Jenny. You're good.
Okay, good. All right, I'm going to share my screen again so we get sound. This is a video. We're going to see Larry Ainsworth talking. And he's going to talk about teacher clarity and how it is foundational to some of the other influences that we use in our classroom. Thank you for being patient. Jewett, let me know that we can hear sound.
Good on sound.
Thank you.
of the reasons why we're really excited about this is, I don't know if you've noticed it, but there seems to be some gaps where people understand the terms, they've heard about this, but they really don't have a clarity and distinctions about what each of the terms means. And they also, more importantly, often don't know how to come up with them. What's the process for identifying with clarity the learning intentions and success criteria? So if you'll notice, the subtitle is how to bring clarity to student learning outcomes. I believe we have a clarity problem in our schools. And when I talk about that, when I'm talking about the fact is we really are not crystal clear about what we want our students to know and be able to do. The thing is that without clarity of learning goals that really provide a sharp focus for instruction, assessment design, and then using those results to inform next steps in instruction, we can't possibly achieve all these wonderful effect sizes that Dr. Hattie's talking about. We can't really see and reap a maximum impact on student learning because we aren't really sure about where we're beginning from. We need a solid foundation stone from which to work. But assessment capable learners are kids who know where I'm going, how I'm going, and where am I going next. And one of the things about this is I'm going to try to make this point here is about clarity. Clarity, clarity, clarity. And the idea is clarity itself has a 0.75 effect size. Well, that's not bad. That's like almost 2 years of growth for students within 1 year. But I'd like to propose the idea that actually this is arguably the most important effect of all of them because its impact on all the other, because of its impact on all the other practices, it makes it of greater importance than maybe even the research shows. And I'll give you an example. So students who are able to articulate what their learning outcomes and test results might be are more likely to be successful than other learners. Would you agree? Okay, so the next thing is, that's why they get a 1.44. These are kids who can pretty much predict what their grades are going to be, how they're going to do. But what does that start with? They have to have clarity about what it is they're learning. And that's why even though teacher clarity in and of itself wouldn't seem like it's off the charts, it's still critically important for all these other effects. Another example, RTI, response to intervention, is in the top 5. But the idea, think about this, for kids to really have a plan, for teachers to have a plan that will really allow students to close their learning gaps, they have to have the clarity of what they're trying to do, right? Just one more, and there's so many more. Think about feedback. Meaningful feedback has an effect size of 0.75. If and when, but here's the catcher, if and when what? That feedback is directly related to clear learning outcomes. So this is why I'm saying that this could very well possibly be the most important effect because it makes all the other effects possible. It's very difficult to talk about learning intentions and feedback without what? Assessment. Like, how are we going to know if the kids are actually...
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pause the video there. And again, just bear with me while I get back to the presentation. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing for 1 second to make sure that the sound quality is still going to be good when you hear us speaking. So hopefully some of the things that you heard Larry Ainsworth talking about and why clarity matters and why it's so important. Hopefully he reiterated some of the points that we've been discussing. And you see that teacher clarity is foundational. That's what we really want to come across here. And so when thinking about that, think about how something like collective teacher efficacy, which has a huge effect size on student learning. In order for us to have this strong collective belief that we can impact student learning, we have to have confidence in ourselves and confidence in each other that we know and understand our content. In the video, he mentioned RTI. Again, in order for us to be able to provide quality interventions, we need to understand our standards at a deep level so we know exactly, we're better able to decide how to provide those interventions. Classroom discussion, it's so important to student learning. And again, it's one of those things where you can have great classroom discussions in your classroom, but if it's not to the level of the standards, if it's not rigorous enough, or if it's, you know, sort of, if you're having your kids talk about the wrong thing, then again, it's not going to have that high of an effect size. So, and then he also mentioned meaningful feedback, and there's lots more. So just make sure that we understand that what we do really begins with teacher clarity. I'm going to mention one other influence, and you can see a book here on the screen, Developing Assessment Capable Visible Learners. And you may have heard this term, or you may not. It's right now one of the #1 effect sizes. And the idea here is, again, think about teacher clarity. In order for students to have clarity, it begins with us as the teachers. And so, and we don't just want students to have clarity about what they're learning, we really want them to become drivers and owners of their learning. So a assessment capable learner would be able to answer those 3 questions that you see on the screen. I know what I'm trying to learn. I know the end in mind, and they would know that with clear learning intentions and success criteria that we've co-constructed and shared with our students. They know how they are progressing. They're very aware of, they're able to formatively assess themselves, if you will. And they know what they need to learn next. They're able to sort of drive that learning and decide what their next steps are. We realize it's no easy task to develop assessment capable learners, but again, we feel like that begins with clarity for ourselves. Okay, and then Jackie is getting ready to start talking here, and she's going to talk about the clarity problem. So like Jewett mentioned earlier in our success criteria for today, that sometimes we think, well, I know my standards and I use learning intentions and success criteria. We don't always realize we have a clarity problem. And so this is a good way to sort of reflect on your own practices and sometimes notice when, you know what, maybe I'm not as clear as I think as I should be. So Jackie, I'm going to go ahead and let you take over.
All right, thank you. Okay, so as Jenny so eloquently spoke about, there are 5 components, essential components in the clarity understanding, the clarity work. But there are also 5 components of the clarity problem, and those are listed on your screen. We're going to look at those in greater detail here in just a second. But the first one is fragmented teaching and learning. The second one is activity-driven instruction. The third one is misaligned strategies. The fourth is lack of progress monitoring of learning. There's a key component there. And then unhelpful assessment data. Addressing these 5 components of the clarity problem, we really have to work hard to disintegrate them little by little. It's not going to happen overnight. But as with any progress we make in schools, it takes time and a systematic approach to really to clarity to ensure that it's deeply ingrained as a process. So as you think of that and really start focusing on the clarity problem and reflecting on your own practices to see if there's a clarity problem within your instruction, we can really move things forward. Okay, so our first actual problem is called fragmented teaching and learning. And when I think of this, excuse me, I immediately think of me teaching, or I relate that to my practices if I were to teach one content area much more than I taught another content area, or spent a lot more time on each other. It actually goes much deeper than that. We have to really think of fragmented teaching and learning as there are some disconnects in lessons, and those disconnects don't support a deeper learning and a transfer of knowledge for our students. Also, lessons that are more focused on the discrete skills and concepts, which is good. I don't want anybody to misunderstand that. Of course, there are skills and concepts that are crucial to our standards, to standards mastery for our students. But students have to make connections to a big picture. And if they aren't able to do that within the lessons that we provide, then that becomes fragmented teaching. Then also there are misconceptions. Students always come into a class with some possible misconceptions and even preconceptions that are prevalent, but those are prevalent due to that disconnect that we talked about, and then the lack of depth of understanding for our students. And students have to be able to connect the new things that they're learning to what they already know. And in order for us to truly maximize our instruction and maximize what the students gain from our lessons, they have to be able to connect to what they already know. So that's kind of a deeper look into what fragmented teaching and learning is.
Sorry, Jackie, I had to unmute myself for just 1 second.
Okay.
I just wanted to mention, like, a good example of this is if you are just following your textbook or following a program almost sort of blindly without understanding why, without helping kids make those connections or seeing why the textbook chose to put things in a certain order. I think that that's also a good example of fragmented teaching and learning.
Yes, thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble advancing the slide.
Okay, so the second component of the clarity problem is activity-driven instruction. And I can relate to this as well, and I'm sure we all can. We always had that favorite lesson or that favorite unit that we wanted to teach because the students had the most fun with it. They were the most engaged in the process and the activities. We would get real excited and real energetic about a specific lesson or a unit that we were about to teach. But sometimes when we would teach those lessons or units, they could or could not be connected to the standards the way they should be. Really tightly aligned. So we have to think about that as we design our activities and the engagement that we ask our students to do. It must be aligned to those standards. So activity-driven instruction, that part of the clarity problem is when the activity takes precedence over the learning, and we really focus on that activity too much, or teaching that favorite lesson that I was just talking about, or students being more focused on the specifics of the activity or the task itself rather than what they're learning from the task and why they're being asked to complete the task. And Jewett has a great analogy for this, and I was going to hope she would share that with you.
Absolutely. So part of our work as continuous improvement coaches sometimes requires us to do walkthroughs in buildings with administrators. So I was doing a walkthrough with a group of admin at a middle school, went into a science classroom, and the students were so engaged in the activity. They were building roller coasters out of toilet paper tubes and using marbles to roll down their roller coasters that they had built. They were up on the tables. It was just really a really cool activity that they were doing. So I walked over to a group of students and I just asked them to explain to me what they were doing. And they said, we're building roller coasters. And so I said, well, why are you building these roller coasters? Expecting them to, make a reference to the content. And they just kind of looked at me and said, well, because they're fun. Like, they really didn't know why they were building roller coasters. So I asked a few more questions, and I did eventually get them to start talking a little bit about force and motion and friction. But that, to me, is exactly what popped into my head when we started learning about activity-driven instruction, because they were so focused on the activity that they missed the connection to the learning, and they weren't really able to articulate why they were doing the activity. So we have to be really careful. I'm not saying at all not to do those cool activities, and that's not what Jackie's saying either. Mm-hmm. But we have to make sure that students understand the relevance of that activity to the content standards, because if they're not mastering those standards, then the activity was all for nothing.
Yes, thank you, Jewett. All right, so the third component of the clarity problem is misaligned strategies. And we all know that there are these professional learning moments when we would learn new teaching strategies in our work, and we'd get real excited and want to go back to school and implement those strategies immediately. We want to try them out and see if they work. I was always excited when I learned a new teaching strategy and wanted to bring it back immediately. But part of the clarity problem is misaligned strategies. The strategy is being used in the classroom, but it doesn't match the learning needs of the student. So when we think of a strategy, it has to, again, be tightly aligned to those standards and the standards work that gears our students toward that success criteria. And it has to be aligned tightly. Misaligned between the learning intention, success criteria, the student work, and the assessment measures. And then we selected that instructional strategy and it doesn't support the level of learning required of the learning target. So we have to be careful within our planning and be very diligent in our planning to make sure that the strategies we use are going to be the most effective. For instance, we want to make sure that the target and activity match. So the target may say analyze, but the activity really only requires identify, or possibly an exit slip task does not truly measure the learning intentions. So a great analogy for this is if we were to use a Band-Aid for a headache. Obviously, we're not going to do that. We're going to use other medical therapies that will eliminate a headache. So we want to keep that in mind when we're aligning our strategies to the learning targets and the success criteria for our students. So the next one is lack of progress monitoring of learning. And many times when we see the words progress monitoring, we think of the progress monitoring of the larger assessments, possibly the larger assessments we have in our school, whether that be MAP or iReady, K-Prep, the things like those assessments, we think of that larger scale progress monitoring. But progress monitoring has to occur each and every day in the classroom. It's day to day, minute by minute. So lack of progress monitoring is when the teachers and learners are unsure of the progress they're making toward the intended learning. It's that lack of formative assessment experience is paired with that timely feedback, and that timely means that minute by minute, day by day feedback to our students, and the limited opportunities for the students to respond and recall and maybe even reorganize and make meaning of their learning. So when we think of that lack of formative assessment, we think that and limited feedback, sometimes teachers may wait till the last minute or the end of the learning to offer feedback to the students. But then that can cause things to really pile up on the students and lead to frustration for them, both for the student and the teacher. And they get that overwhelming feeling. So as the learners engage in learning process, that successful learning progression of learning involves monitoring students through formative assessment and effective feedback. And if we don't offer the students the opportunity to recall and reorganize and make meaning of that learning, we don't give them the opportunities to make their learning visible. So we can't appropriately adjust our instruction, and that is the most important part, is adjusting our instruction so that we make sure that to support the students in their learning. And the fifth component is unhelpful assessment data. And we think of assessment data being, again, those larger scale assessments, whether it be the school-wide assessments or our in-class summative assessments. We think of those being our assessment data, and that's what we use. But assessment data can be formative day-to-day assessments as well. And we want to make sure that when we assess our students, that assessment is truly gearing towards that success criteria, and it really has to align. But so unhelpful assessment data is when the data doesn't inform the next steps of the teaching and learning. Students have to be able to process what they are being asked to do and what they need to do next. So the assessment has to be able to do that. And if it doesn't, then it's unhelpful assessment. Then assessments that don't fully align to the learning intentions and success criteria, if it's just an activity that you're having the students do to be doing it, of course, that's an unhelpful assessment. But then sometimes we provide rubrics even that are kind of overarching or umbrella type, and the terms are subjective or unclear. So when we think of rubrics, we really have to think more depth of vocabulary in those rubrics, more detailed information, so that the students can really pull from that where they are in their learning and advance forward. So data should be very useful to both teachers and the students, and possibly discuss the co-construction of those rubrics that we were just talking about and success criteria. Assessment data should lead to next steps in the learning, like we said, and multiple choice test questions that give info on what they missed in the question, of course, needs to be thought of as well. Data must tell teachers what they need to know. Data from assessments must align to the teaching and learning that has taken place thus far in the classroom and the students' need or the learning intention and success criteria. So we're going to take a moment now, as we've looked at all 5 components of the clarity problem. We want to know, or as far as for you and your school, as this is a recording, we want you to have a conversation. Do any of these clarity problems resonate with you? I know when I went through them, I reflected and thought of some moments where there was clarity problems within my instruction. So this is a good moment to stop and reflect and see if those clarity problems resonate with you. And if they do, what are ways to eliminate those as much as we possibly can for our students? And then how can we use PLCs to ensure we're avoiding these problems in the future? So we want you to stop and take a moment to reflect and have a rich discussion over these 2 items on the screen. And we'll come back with you and talk a little bit more of how to think about clarity more in general with PLCs. Okay, well, thank you for the pause, and we appreciate you taking the time to have rich discussion. We're sure that it is going to be most beneficial to your work moving forward. But when we think about PLCs, we want PLCs to be most effective. And PLCs to be effective, we have to have the meaningful discussions that are going to move our work towards student achievement. So we've provided a model here. The difference between traditional instruction or traditional planning and work of the standards to backward design. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But in the very center of the screen, we have some PLC driving questions. And I really like these because they're a great way to add to a PLC protocol and ensure that we're talking about the things we need to talk about in PLCs each time we meet to make that conversation more meaningful and more intentional. But on the left of the screen, you see the traditional model. You might see some of the clarity problems we just discussed in them, such as activity-driven instruction, where we begin with activities in the instruction. On the right side, though, you're going to see backwards design. And backward design allows us to start by deconstructing our standards into learning intentions. Then we build our assessments so they're aligned to those learning intentions. And finally, we develop and choose the appropriate task and instructional strategies that are tightly related to success and mastery. So as we look at the deconstruction process a little more in depth, that's one of the ways we really gain teacher clarity. we gain it through our standards deconstruction process, and we should really work collaboratively to deepen our understanding of our standards. And part of our PLC process should include discussions where we break our standards into skills and concepts. And we also take time to align our thinking about the sequence of learning and the big ideas we want our students to understand. And finally, we develop and revise clear learning intentions and success criteria. So now we're going to see a video from the author himself, John Almerode, and he's really going to talk about clarity and that deconstruction process and what clarity looks like in the classroom just a little bit deeper.
Okay, ladies, just let me know that we can hear it. My video's being a little bit slow. Give me 1 second.
It looks like it's trying, Jenny.
Okay, it just popped up on my end. Let me give it a try.
What is it you want them to learn today?
We're good on sound.
I don't know as the teacher. Before I walk in that classroom tomorrow, we got a problem. What do I want my student, not what I want them to do. I want them to complete a worksheet. No, that's what you want them to do. What do you want them to learn? I want them to do 2-digit subtraction or learn 2-digit subtraction with regrouping. Now we're getting somewhere. How will you know they're successful? What will the success criteria be for the day? And can we spell it out? Do I have an image in my mind of what success looks like today? And then do I share that with the learners? What will I do along the way to monitor it? How will I check in every so often to see, are you progressing up the success criteria? Or have you hit a snag and we need to provide some intervention or support? What tasks and experiences am I going to provide for my learners so that it gives them the highest probability of becoming proficient or mastering the learning for that day? And then what about those that aren't on grade level with us? What about those that haven't yet figured it out or yet mastered it? How am I going to adjust my tasks so that all learners have an equitable access and opportunity to get into that learning? That's the equity and inclusivity of well-being. How do we make sure it is equitable and inclusive? And then the final part is, what am I going to do with this information next? How am I going to give them feedback so that they know what's next in their learning and they don't believe that learning has somehow stopped just because the bell rang? And so the feedback should be, here's where you are, here's where I need you to be, and here's what you're going to do next to get there. Because it is still a process and it is still a cycle, and the feedback is what conveys that. And so it's those questions, it's that internal dialogue that we have to have as professionals to make sure we set up the type of environment that promotes engagement. It promotes high impact instruction. It promotes high outcome and high growth learning. So a learning target or a learning intention is just simply, what are we learning? It's not what we're doing. It's not the task. It's what we're learning. So for example, it might be presented to students verbally or on the board, but it might sound like this. Today we're learning about the relationship between mass and volume and the density of a substance. That's a learning intention. It's not, we're going to do a lab on density. That's not a learning intention or a learning target. That's a task. So a learning intention is the big idea, the concept, what are we learning? Today we are learning about figurative language and its role in establishing author's purpose. Today we are learning about the impact of ancient civilizations on things of today, or events or elements of modern culture. It's the big concept. It's what we want students to understand or learn today, the next 2 days, or this week. So the learning intention can be something that stretches over a period of 1 or 2 days. But for every learning intention, we have very specific success criteria. And success criteria are the elements that would give us evidence that the student is progressing towards his or her learning intention. And those things need to be immediate. What are the success criteria today? What are the things that would give me evidence that students are going to show, or evidence I'm going to look for, that tells me whether they are or aren't progressing towards the learning intention? So let's go back to the ancient civilizations learning intention. We are learning how ancient civilizations played a role in things that we do today in the modern world. One of the success criteria might be I can list examples of ancient civilizations. I can describe the culture of ancient civilizations. And that may be all I get to today, because tomorrow I'm going to move it a step forward. I can compare and contrast things from ancient civilizations with things today in 2017. So your success criteria need to be something that you can aim for and reasonably get done today. But the learning intent.
Okay, so as we're reflecting on that video, John Almarode really spoke a bunch about evidence, and that's what we were talking about within the clarity problem. We have to eliminate all the components of that clarity problem in order for students to give and produce that evidence we need for them to move forward in their learning. So the next slide that Jenny's going to put up for you is just us circling back to the 5 components, the 5 essential components of clarity. And we know that we are in the very beginning stages of that gaining clarity component. That's why we have the star there in the chart. But something to really think about in the PLC process is taking this chart of the essential components, and putting them side by side to the 5 components of the clarity problem, and working together with those to ensure that we're gaining that clarity as much as we possibly can for the benefit of our students. So we wanted to circle back to this chart so you could really see what John Almarode was really talking about. And you can see as you progress through the chart how that evidence can be much more clearly produced in the students' learning. So as we continue on in this clarity journey, much like students, teachers need to see themselves as learners as well. So we want you to think about, if you get the opportunity to look in the book, Clarity for Learning by John Almarode, there are some litmus tests that go through the process. And just gaining a greater awareness of where you are in your clarity journey is always a great place to start. So think about that if you have the opportunity to look in the book. But if you don't, this is kind of where we are in the journey, and really one of the first steps that we recommend in this process. As you're charting that clarity journey, gaining insight on where to start is really important, and why to start there, and then how you know you're ready to move on. But one of the most important components is changing that practice after you receive feedback and you reflect on your lesson and your lessons and your instruction. John Hattie, of course, actually has a foreword in this book of charting or in Clarity for Learning, and he speaks about the most successful teachers are those that have the dispositions to ask and examine their performance and make changes based on the student feedback. It doesn't necessarily say that in this book, but that's a huge component there, is that we're willing to change things up so we can meet the needs of our students the best way we know how. Jewett?
All right, well, we're going to wrap things up here. We hope that as you have gone through this time with us today, thinking about clarity, that you've made some really good reflective insights, and you've really thought about your own practice and how this information may apply in your context, in your classroom, and in your school. So on the next slide, we're going to revisit here the learning intentions that we set forth at the beginning of the training. And you may recall that we said our purpose for today was that we're learning about clarity and its impact on teaching and learning. So look back over those success criteria and think about whether or not you feel confident in saying that you accomplished those criteria today. One thing that we would really like for you to think about, I know some of you watching this video have probably already had some extensive work in the standards. If you have not, it may benefit you to go back and really spend some time digging into the Kentucky academic standards in your content area and having collaborative conversations with your content team or your grade level team to ensure that you all have that clarity of understanding of your standards. Also, some good follow-up to this training, if you're thinking about next steps, may be to continue through that clarity journey on that graphic that we've showed several times. We've really just touched the very beginning piece of gaining clarity, but there's much more extensive learning to be done about sharing clarity with students and giving feedback with clarity and collaborating with clarity. So that might be some work that you may do to follow up, or you may want to go into really looking for some of those high impact strategies in Hattie's work, those instructional strategies, and even thinking about how you're delivering instruction in a systematic way, whether that's virtually or face-to-face, thinking about how the gradual release of responsibility model could help you to build those assessment capable learners. But whatever your next step is in your professional learning, we really hope that you will think about how it connects to clarity and be reminded that throughout this training today, you heard Larry Ainsworth talk about it, you heard John Almarode talk about it, and you've heard us talk about it. Clarity really is that foundational piece that makes all of the other impactful things that we do in our classrooms possible. So if we don't have clarity, all of those other things that we're doing to try to increase student achievement are not going to be as effective as they should be. So just to wrap up here, you'll see this last slide has our contact information. If you are watching this video as part of a personal professional learning experience and you need ELA credit, you can email myself, Jewett Wells, or Jennifer Donnelly, or Jackie Thompson. Those are the three of us that presented this training. Just send us an email and let us know that you took part in this training and that you need ELA credit, and we will work on getting that to you. If you are watching this video as part of a larger professional development experience, maybe with your district or your school, then you may need to talk to a school administrator about how to, get documentation that you participated. But if you need ELA credit, feel free to reach out. Also, if you would like for one of us to follow up with your school or district for further support, in that we can offer further training in clarity work, or we can offer further training in a lot of different areas. You can check out our website if you go to the Kentucky Department of Education and look at the continuous improvement pages. We offer lots of different areas of support there as well. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope that you learned a little bit more about teacher clarity.
Thank you.